Sunday in January, and we've been spending this New Year month looking at some new ideas that I came across in a book called The Big Picture by Caltech theoretical physicist Sean Carroll. And the basic idea, I just want to remind everyone every Sunday, the basic idea behind this book is that human beings are part of a physical universe that is governed by one set of natural laws. One set of rules which I kind of like because we're the unity movement, which means oneness and one thing. Manifesting is a lot of different things, but one set of rules. But just because there's one reality and one set of rules doesn't mean that there can be only one way of talking about it. That's the point he's trying to make. There are many ways to talk about the universe, many ways to tell the story of what we see unfolding around us. The stories that we tell, the words that we use, the vocabulary have completely changed over time. Think about it this way. In ancient times, human beings would look around at the natural world and they tried to explain why certain things happened. They told stories about it based on the vocabulary, based on the knowledge that they had at the time. And when they tried to explain these things, they usually would come up with supernatural explanations for what they were seeing. The sun, it appears to move across the sky. And back in those days, the only way that human beings knew of for things to move is if somebody physically picked them up and moved them. Somebody would have to do the job of moving them. So the story they told was that the sun moved across the sky because a god did it. The god was named Helios, and he carried the sun in his chariot across the sky. That was the story that they told based on their knowledge at the time. Our ancestors had all sorts of supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. Thunder, lightning, rainbows, sunrise, sunset, storms, volcanoes, you name it, some god probably did it. And all of those things turned out to have perfectly natural explanations. The sun doesn't really move across the sky. The earth is rotating, so it only looks like the sun is moving in the sky. We now know the properties of light. We know how raindrops, little raindrops, can split the visible light into the color spectrum that we see in a rainbow. Natural explanations for what was once considered supernatural. I have yet to hear about anything that we thought was perfectly natural giving away to a supernatural explanation. It just doesn't seem to work that way. So the point here I'm trying to make is that even though we understand why the sun seems to move across the sky and seems to rise and set, and even though we understand how the atmosphere reacts with visible light to produce colors that make a rainbow and a sunrise and a sunset so beautiful, knowing all of that doesn't make them any less enjoyable, does it? Sunrise, sunsets, rainbows are still beautiful. The sun still does what it does. The light still does what it does. The only thing that has changed is the way we talk about it. The only thing that has changed is the story that we tell about it. We've added more words to our vocabulary, another chapter to the story that we're crafting. And it doesn't mean that we have to throw out the old stories, but we just have to recognize that, well, that was based on what we knew. They're charming. They tell us something about where we've been, but we move on to a new story. So that brings us to our topic for today, which is consciousness. It's one of those words that we throw around a lot in Unity. What is it, and how do we explain it? I have a very short definition of consciousness that I've come across here, one that I think would fit on a bumper sticker. Consciousness, that annoying time between naps. I said it was short. I didn't say it was snarky. It is. And it's one way of looking at it, but here's another way of looking at it. Dr. Carroll, in his book, The Big Picture, points out that consciousness is not a single brain organ or even a single activity in the brain or mind. He calls it a complex interplay of processes acting on multiple levels. It involves wakefulness, receiving and responding to sensory inputs, imagination, inner experience, and volition, and that list isn't even exhaustive at that point. And it's actually pretty close to the classic definition of consciousness that we hear in Unity. This is the way we learned about it when we were taking the spiritual education and enrichment classes. This is the way we learned about it back at Unity Institute. The short definition that we use in Unity usually goes like this. Consciousness is the composite of all the ideas, thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, and knowledge held in mind, both conscious and subconscious. I said it was close. The only thing, our definition certainly has that complexity and the multi-layer processes that are going on. The only thing it leaves out is the methodology by which all of that comes into our awareness, which is really not our focus in Unity. That's not the thing that we have to focus on. We're more concerned with the content of consciousness. We don't have to explain how synapses and memories and things like that work. We know that it's there. We know that the content is there, and it's really more important, or I should say most important to us, to talk about how we regulate the inflow and the outflow of the content of consciousness. What do we allow in, and what do we do with what's already there? That's a big question. That is a big question. So here's the question about consciousness that we get from the book, The Big Picture. The special feature of self-awareness, the ability to have a rich inner life and reflect on one's place in the universe, seems to demand a special kind of explanation, a unique place in the big picture. Is consciousness just a way of talking about the behavior of certain kinds of collections of atoms obeying the laws of physics? That's the question he asks. And note, the word just is in quotes. He's saying, is that all there is? Is it possible that that's all there is? Is it just or merely the behavior of atoms obeying the laws of physics? Is that what consciousness is all about? Or does it have to be something really special beyond that? Now remember, we used to say the same things about rainbows and sunsets, right? They're so beautiful. They're so colorful. How could there possibly be a natural explanation for something so special? Well, we know now, don't we? We know now. And as we said, being able to explain how something happens as a physical process takes nothing away from our experience, takes nothing away from our enjoyment of the experience, the utility, the practical effect of the experience. You know, for the last year now, I just realized this last Monday when we started out our Frontiers of Consciousness class for the new year, we've been doing that class for a year now. And I think it's safe to say that what we're finding out is that we are far from a complete understanding of what consciousness is. However, everything is pointing to some kind of complex physical process at the root of the whole thing. And if that proves to be the case, we still have to deal with the very important ramifications of being conscious, self-aware beings on a planet where we have to get along with other conscious, self-aware beings, and then contemplate the absurdity of life and mortality, or the full catastrophe, as Zorba the Greek used to say. We still have to deal with all of that. Even if we can explain it, we still have that ahead of us. Our entire experience of this life that we have is totally dependent on the contents of consciousness, totally dependent on the thoughts, the emotions, the memories that make up what we call human consciousness. But is that all there is to it, just human consciousness? That's the other question. Is consciousness limited to our human experience of it? That's another unanswered question out there. It's a question that keeps coming up over and over again for me. What is the meaning of consciousness before there was any life in the universe? What are we talking about then? Not just human life, but I mean any life at all. We know that this universe is 14 billion years old, and for billions of years there was no biological life forms because the only thing in the universe was hydrogen and helium. Now, that may sound like a limited menu, so to speak, but the possibilities going forward from just those things was practically unlimited. Hydrogen fused into helium and billions of stars, and we started getting the rest of the building blocks and oxygen and carbon and all that stuff and water and planets and eventually life. And eventually not just life, but self-aware, thinking, conscious human life. So why should I conclude that my experience is the only experience of consciousness? What is consciousness apart from this human perspective that I find myself in? And all I can do is step back and remind myself and contemplate the fact that everything that has gone before in the course of 14 billion years has combined to produce this experience that we have, that we call human consciousness, our experience of it. And when I take that perspective, I have to conclude that perhaps this experience that we're all having is just another step in the ongoing process. It ain't over. What we see each step of the way is an amazing and awe-inspiring demonstration of creativity, even when there were no human minds as part of that process. Someone once described that moment-to-moment, step-by-step process as blending the past with the possible. The natural universe seems to be very, very good at doing that, blending the past with the possible. A human mind is not required. But what is it that guides the blending, creative process? And this is where words still fail us. And there are lots of words we can choose. Lots of words we can use to label that process, many stories that we can tell, and whatever word or story we choose, God, mind, universe, consciousness, we have to be really careful not to create it in our own image, to project our human traits as if our experience and our perspective is somehow final and the ultimate when it comes to this thing we call consciousness. The great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said that the universe is the creative advance into novelty, something new, something different. It's dynamic, it's creative, it moves forward, it expands, and it leads to things that are new, and for me, that's exciting. That's something I want to be a part of. I want a life that is open-ended, filled with those possibilities. Whether you're a scientist, a philosopher, a spiritual seeker, the true joy is in the search. The true joy is not in cutting off avenues of inquiry. We discover new things, which always leads to a new search, and that's what makes life worth living for me. So, how might this make our lives better? How would knowing this make our lives better? Well, it's a perspective that assures me that no matter what challenges we might be facing as a species on this planet, so long as we're involved in a sincere effort to ask the big questions and keep looking, we'll be able to meet any challenge, knowing that that dynamic, creative solution is going to emerge from our collective efforts. We're always going to be presented with possibilities and the opportunities to blend the past with the possible. provided that we don't cut off the avenues of inquiry based on dogma and ideology, whether political or religious. Those are the things that'll stop us in our tracks. You know, one of the most significant extinction events in the history of Earth happened millions of years ago. It happened when this horrible toxic substance called oxygen appeared in our atmosphere. Oxygen, we can't live without it, but long before mammals came along, oxygen was a deadly toxic gas. It killed off most of the life forms on the planet at that time, and then life adapted. And eventually, we came along with our human experience of consciousness and everything that goes along with that. We are one of the end results of that process, and we get to perpetuate, to participate, to expand whatever that is, whatever it's going to be, in a way that's unique and creative, and which, as we all know so well, presents its own challenges and responsibilities. By right of consciousness, we choose and we co-create the reality that the human family is going to be experiencing. Which is why in Unity, our primary focus is learning how to better control the inflow and the outflow of consciousness. That song that we did at the beginning of the service, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? John rewrote it a little bit. There's a better way of thinking if we try. If we try. That's what we're looking for. What is that better way of thinking? How do we better regulate the inflow and the outflow? Why does there seem to be such an increase in fear and anger and this growing tribal mentality around us? Consciousness. Collective human behavior is a reflection of the dominant content of human consciousness. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say. And xenophobia, racism, nationalism, and misogyny are indeed garbage. That's what happens when people forget about the big picture. That's when they forget about the creative advance and decide to retreat into ideology, whether it's political or religious. When we exclude the big picture and the creative advance from consciousness, the result is likely to be unpleasant. And until we decide to do something about it, well, it's going to happen. It's going to go on. We're the ones that have to decide what to do about it, and we all know where that begins, don't we? I'm going to close today with a quote from our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, who tells us exactly where it begins. This is from his book, Atom-Smashing Power of Mind. He says, "We are now in the midst of a race transition in which we are taking a very pronounced upward swing in the development of the ideal man planted in us in the beginning. A new concept of God, man, and the universe is upon us. We must realize this and go upward with the mighty urge for higher things. Will God take us to an imaginary heaven in a chariot of fire, or do we use our mind to lift ourselves heavenward?" That's where it begins. See you next week.